Hello, I'm David Tao, and welcome again to the Theories of Everything program. Viewers, this is our fourth program in the Big Picture series, Theories of Civilization, in which we trace the patterns of history from the beginnings of modern civilization, if you like, around 13,000 years ago, to the present 21st century, and look at the prognosis as well for the future. So in our first program, we examined how early humans migrated to the big river deltas after the end of the big glaciation period. Those enormously rich deltas in which all sorts of plant species were there for the taking and therefore the developing, in all the major river systems across the planet, from the Tigris, Euphrates and the Nile through to the Ganges and the Yangtze in China and India. All these major river systems became the centres for new civilization. Humans had learnt that by practicing on how to develop and nurture those cereal crops, they could provide enough food so that they didn't have to continuously hunt and gather, and would enable them some time to settle down, develop arts and crafts. They didn't think of it in that way, of course, but that's exactly what happened. They developed the first beginnings of early civilization, villages, for example. And of course this happened independently right across all these major centres. It also occurred in other parts of the world, again in Papua New Guinea, and in early centres, for example, in Mexico and the Andes. But it happened independently because there was no information flows, or very little at that stage, across these major centres, and they all developed similar patterns. Which was very interesting because they had to. They all developed early alphabet systems, reading systems, writing systems, number systems to keep track of what they'd grown and to keep their records intact. And from there developed, again, the first basis of modern civilization. In our second program we followed this through and saw how each of these major centres developed larger and larger towns, cities and eventually city-states based on the major trading hubs, the control hubs that controlled the flow of goods and services across these areas, and how they started to expand to gain more resources, and how eventually that led to wars and fighting, which of course had always occurred, tribal fighting since the beginning of humans on the planet. But basically, these empires expanded and they developed in a very sophisticated ways, lots of new goods and services using new metals, techniques, new religious, huge building programs, infrastructure, religious shrines, etc., culminating in structures like the pyramids and the great temples of Greece and so forth. They all developed these civilizations in very sophisticated ways using stratification of society. There were soldiers, peasants, bureaucrats, priests, kings, etc., to manage the empires. So they had to learn all this from scratch. So the great empires of Babylonia, eventually defeated by the Persian Empire, eventually defeated by the Greek Empire, which was massive, extending from Africa through to India, Alexander the Great, then the huge Roman Empire, Caesar and many others being part of that as well. And there we saw another major pattern emerging, the flows of cultures and information between these great empires. As one defeated another, culture didn't stop. It got permeated, it got absorbed into their art and architecture and language and the way they managed even law, for example, and the way they managed their empires. They all learnt, and so this huge diversity, this huge mix of cultures right across Europe, eventually engulfing also the Germanic states, the Slavic states, the Turkish states, etc. This massive mixing led to a huge innovation in middle and later times, which we examined in that second episode up to around about 500 AD. In the third program, this continued. Ways of managing empires, ways of managing the emergence of nation states, for example, according to language and culture. These mini empires, if you like, in Europe emerged and of course extended their influence across into the new territories of America and the Far East and Africa. So in our fourth program we are going to look at the next major patterns that emerged. We're going to look at some of the major substrates that started to emerge from the period of the Renaissance, from the period of the 15th, 16th centuries, onward through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries particularly. The emergence of new discoveries in science, philosophy, and of course leading through to the great new technologies of the Industrial Revolution, which reshaped Western civilization. Now, viewers, the concept of a substrate or information flow of history is relatively novel and fairly new. Many historians focus basically on the major events of history, on the wars and changes and reforms and rulers and dynasties and so forth. But underneath all this there is a continuous flow, and it's a flow that continues regardless of who wins what war. There's a constant, there may be slowdowns, there may be, for example, when Genghis Khan's Tatar hordes overran a large slice of Europe, Russia, etc. in the 13th, 12th century, a lot of the culture of the time was lost, it was wiped out. But regardless, the information flows continued, and it regained its momentum after these major, if you like, barbaric wars ceased, because wars had been continuing not only throughout current civilization from 13,000 years ago, but of course from the beginning of human emergence on this planet well over 3 million years ago. Constant battles, constant fighting. But the flows of the gains, the net aggregation of flows in knowledge through the arts, through the sciences, through the passing on of ways of living, ways of managing from each generation continued. Again with ups and downs. But basically this flow is vital. And by the 17th century, post-Renaissance if you like, the Renaissance set the stage. It involved a renewal of faith in humanism, not so much faith in religion at that stage, because religion was seen as fairly corrupt and was going through its own reformation and splitting process. But basically it was seen, humans were seen in a new light, and there were major events starting to capture the imagination of humans. Remember, a lot of this information could now be passed on because printing had been developed in the 15th century. So books enable this information to be disseminated. And of course, printing was first evolved in China around about the 13th century. But it took off in Europe around the 15th, 16th century. So this information could be further developed, and it could be further distributed through all civilizations, and it was. Because, for example, the Babylonian Empire had a lot to contribute, for example, in the sciences through observational astronomy. The Greeks, of course, had an enormous amount of information to disseminate on in terms of mathematics, geometry, for example. And this was the Arabian countries developed this further through algebra, and of course that set that development in with mathematicians such as Euclid, Archimedes, Apollonius, etc., combined with the new algebraic symbolism, became the basis for the emergence of the great mathematics of the 17th, 18th centuries, the mathematics of Descartes, Leibniz and Newton, in which the calculus was developed, analytical geometry, new tools and techniques for examining and explaining the phenomena around, including the motion, particularly the motion of the planets. So we see that this flow continues and permeates as each country conquers, as each nation state, as each empire conquers others. This information flows through generally. Now we come to this period, particularly one of the major issues concerning humans and gradually sort of permeating their subconsciousness, if you like, was the issue of how the world got created in the first place and how was it run. Was it run, in fact, by intelligent design? This was the major paradigm. And how was knowledge acquired by the mind? And we see in the 17th, 18th centuries, we see the emergence of major philosophers such as Hume and Locke and Kant, who debated these topics. And each of them was fairly had a view. Each of them some were rationalists, if you like, who believed that the mind could virtually, the same as Descartes, who believed that mind was everything and could explain everything, including mathematics, could explain how the world was designed. Others were empiricists who believed that the only information you could acquire was from observation on a blank slate. This, for example, was Locke's position. Hume's position was more on the, if you like, a sceptical side of things. He believed that you couldn't rationalise everything. Cause and effect was not a done deal, if you like. It was more patterns of human experience. You could not prove cause and effect. This has changed today, of course, and Kant took the middle ground. But each of them was particularly concerned about how the world got to be the way it was. So the God theories, or the intelligent design theories, permeated until, of course, the apple cart was upset by Darwin in the 19th century. This changed everything because it brought change and evolution and an alternative way of looking at how life and species formed and evolved to the mind of humans. Also, there earlier, back in the 15th century, of course, the earlier notion that the Earth was at the centre of the universe had been overturned by Copernicus with his heliocentric theory. Darwin's theory, Copernicus's theory were just hugely controversial, if you like, because they changed the whole paradigm of human thinking. And in between, the great scientists such as Newton also explained along with Kepler and along with Galileo, proving it through observation, through telescopes developed by the Dutch at this stage, that the planetary motions, of course it didn't explain what forces, but explained the equations, the inverse distance square law, for example, holding those bodies, which could predict the positions of those planetary bodies. Didn't explain, though, this mysterious force of gravitation until Einstein in the 20th century, theories of relativity. However, it did change again the way humans looked at themselves. Suddenly they were just one planet revolving around a sun. Suddenly, by the 15th century, the land mass had doubled because of the early explorers, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, etc., had found new lands, which also upset the sort of view that the world revolved around the Mediterranean. And now you come to this massive change on how we all developed and how the Earth might have developed, because there are also sciences developing in geology, medicine, anatomy, zoology, to explain how the rest of the world worked. But anyway, philosophers began to change their stance towards this process of change and evolution, and you get new major philosophies emerging: Teilhard de Chardin, Bergson, the great French philosopher, Schelling, the German philosopher, Alexander, a great Australian philosopher, looking at a becoming universe, an evolving, continuous evolving universe, which is the paradigm today. Now viewers, this substrate of knowledge, this accumulation, constant accumulation of information on how the world worked, cannot be underestimated. It was the underpinning of civilization from the very beginning, on how plants could be grown and farmed, leading right through to the understanding of the laws governing the planets. It's led to the stars, the understanding of better techniques of navigation, cartography, better techniques of building. Right through all those processes leading up to the Industrial Revolution. A revolution being a very, very fast evolutionary process, an explosion, if you like. And a revolution in this case was, even though it was driven often by gifted amateurs who didn't necessarily understand the theoretical underpinnings, eventually the mathematics that was developed earlier, the science that was being developed, for example, Maxwell's electromagnetic theory, for example, was absolutely vital for the development of electricity and electric motors and so forth. But even though a lot of the underpinnings, such as James Watt's steam engine, for example, were developed again by gifted amateurs, not necessarily versed in the latest mathematics, this substrate eventually permeated everything, the mathematics of course being particularly critical to understanding forces, to understanding stresses in the development of buildings, bridges, domes, whatever. So the substrate was critical, but on top of it now we come to the revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and of course the amplification of power. The power of literally of human power, horsepower, had been amplified by water power earlier, but it was the innovation of steam power, the invention by James Watt of the first steam engine, that unleashed huge forces of industrialisation, because any product now virtually could be automatically manufactured using steam power. And of course not only factories could benefit from it, but transport as well. You had the first locomotives, you had the first steam ships, and of course that could travel the Atlantic, cross the Atlantic in 30 days, for example. Railway roads, of course, quickly were built right across Europe and of course America as well. And in fact, around about then the steam power was, of course, taken a stage further by the development of electrical power, the electric motor, and eventually which was more convenient, more compact, simpler, and to run many processes. And of course, then Daimler's invention of the combustion engine led to the development of, through pioneers such as Henry Ford, development of transport for everyone. Everyone in the early 20th century, potentially everyone, had the ability to become mobile, to travel, not just by train, ship, but also by car. Now, in amongst all this innovation, of course, was massive turbulence. That's why it's called revolution. It's not just a revolution in technology, it was a revolution in work practice. Towns became the focus, factories became the focus. Families travelled from the country to get work in the cities, in appalling conditions to start with, 18-hour days, minimal wages, total control by the new emerging bourgeoisie, the new middle class, if you like, that took power and drove everything right down. So of course the workers reacted, tried to develop unions. These were initially cooperatives, these were initially crushed, but eventually succeeded in achieving their aims of better working conditions and better wages. New economic theory developed. Originally laissez-faire market, free flows, natural laws of economics, Adam Smith's treatise. But then reaction to that, a more liberal philosophy, John Stuart Mill, who said that individual self-interest wasn't necessarily the best way to run civilization, to run states, to run industrial empires. So we have not just an industrial revolution in the cities, the growth of the cities, the emergence of new ways of work, the wiping out of the individual craftsmen and craft guilds in many cases, but also the effect on agriculture, automation of agriculture, new machinery, new ways of crop rotation, developing better farming practices as well, but largely automation in the countryside as well as in the cities. So this was such a change, was such a swift change. Remember, the Industrial Revolution occurred largely within 100 years, all these inventions and practices, so that eventually it naturally led to revolution at the social level. Now viewers, quite apart from all the new discoveries in physics and chemistry, the physics and chemistry of gases and thermodynamics, electromagnetism, etc., that underpinned the developments in steam power, electric power, steam turbines, etc., of the 19th century, quite apart from that, there was another major development starting in the Industrial Revolution period. That was the mid-1800s, and that was the development in communication. Communication had been pretty much the same for thousands of years. In fact, early empires had suffered because of lack of good communication capabilities. If there was a problem in the far-flung reaches of their empire with insurgencies, attacks from outside, whatever, it took a long time for that information to reach by boat by foot, by horse, by whatever, to reach the decision centres to take action, and that led to the demise, or was one factor in the demise of empires. Apart from civil strife and external attacks and so forth, natural disasters, this was a major factor. So information suddenly became central. Communication, instant communication, originally through Morse code, telegraphy, then telephony, bell, and then wireless telegraphy at the end of the century. So we have this is an enormous shift for people to cope with, as well as massive changes in work practice, which normally would take place over a generation, a lifetime. This is occurring sort of instantly now. Vast masses of people thrown out of jobs and getting used to these new, good but new, novel types of living communication. But it did in the end, of course, as it has been the precursor of all the information technologies we have today, including the internet and this television program. It has been very useful to people in democracy, or wanting greater share of democracy, a greater process of democracy, and this is what triggered most of the revolutions, the social revolutions across Europe, starting with the English in the 17th century, where they'd always had a parliament, but had been pretty ineffective against absolute monarchs, the Tudors, the Stuarts. Finally, an eruption came and they said, enough's enough, we want more power, and the king should be answerable to the parliament, not the parliament to the king, culminating in the Bill of Rights in 1689. A century later they hadn't learnt a lot, because the American colonists also felt they were poorly done by lack of true representation in key decisions, overtaxed, and finally had enough and called the English bluff, and culminating in the 1776 Declaration of Independence. Again, it's about realisation of human potential, need for input to the decision process, true representative government, true democracy. As a result, the American Republic was born. Now, it didn't stop there, because again the English again came along and established in 1832 another bill defining rights. The French had been under despots for a long time. In this case, even from their original revolution, Philip, who had total control, and basically he was a Bourbon, from the dynasty of Bourbons, and they decided that they weren't represented properly by their parliament, which was the Estates General. There were three layers, and the third level was supposed to be for the common people, the proletariat, but it wasn't properly represented. It was more middle class and noble. So they decided there was a surge in popular opinion that it had to represent the common, ordinary worker, and a stand was taken, and of course eventually they won out. There was a war, there was a battle, but eventually they won out. And unfortunately at that point the new president was Bonaparte, who staged a coup d'etat and became basically a dictator, as the Bourbons had been before him. So they'd come full circle, got their freedom, but had it sort of taken away by Bonaparte, who eventually was demolished by the English and the Russians. And then a more representative government came into being. But as this was happening, and again in the mid-19th century, this was spreading, this wave of revolutions, wave of change, driven by new work practices, but driven by just despotic rulers, a realisation that every individual was as important as any other, should have equal access, equity, under law, judicial processes, government processes, etc. A recognition. So you have Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Italy and Austria and Serbia and Bulgaria, and all those countries, suddenly the flashpoint was reached, the threshold, and the revolution started. And the despots that had been in power, and this occurred also in Germany, and to some extent in Russia, including the Habsburgs of Austria. The Habsburgs have been a dynasty that had been around for hundreds of years, keeping tight control over everything. They were forced to all back down and promised constitutional change, but in fact didn't keep their words and rebounded back very, very quickly and put down and crushed these uprisings in Prague and Budapest and Vienna and Venice, Lombardy, with the help of allies such as the Tsar in Russia and so forth. And it all came to not quite nothing, because these smaller nations, the people of these nations, had had a chance to see a glimpse of democracy. The 20th century began with huge promise, technological revolution that could emancipate everyone, leading to greater wealth, quality of life. Unfortunately, the major social revolutions weren't addressed, the major social conditions, the major rights of individuals in this tumultuous world weren't addressed adequately, leading to two major world wars, greatest disaster in human history, millions and millions of lives unnecessarily lost. But in our fifth and final program, we'll look ahead. We'll look beyond the 20th century, and we'll look at the 21st century and globalisation and the promises that have been. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program. I'll look forward to talking to you again next week.